Perfect. So, welcome to the show, Jacob.
Good to be
After
here, Mahan.
after some mild technical difficulties, we've actually managed to do it, which is good news. But yeah, my first question was, how did you get into Dialogos? How did that start out for you in your life?
I think it honestly started out smoking weed in my bedroom and getting into really deep conversations with a
Nice.
select group of friends
Uh-huh.
whilst I was in university.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah,
shall I
that's
delve
I.
further?
Yeah, I mean, how much weight? No, so, yeah. Well, that's actually. I mean, if I'm thinking about it myself in terms of like really intense conversations, probably had the most intense conversations at house parties at like 6 in the morning, where people were just like, just completely engaged in what they were saying, and there was no like, oh, I'm gonna do this or I'm gonna go here. It was very much present moment and very much about the person you're speaking to as well. I mean, maybe that's a if university, I suppose you're meeting new people and sharing ideas. Was that something that kind of fueled it? Your the university work you were doing?
Totally. Yeah.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I was very interested in, I don't know exactly how to boil it down, but I was interested in the relationship between the West and Islam as something both within
Oh
and
yeah.
outside of the West. And
Uh-huh.
so I kind of started out on a curious track with that during my
Mm.
first year of my history degree, which was at Queen Mary in London. And I was also living in Mile End in East London, which is like a
Mm.
crazy ethnic mixture of
Yeah.
like sort of the last standing Cockneys of the East of actual East
Yeah.
London, and there's not many of them. And
Mm.
then Bangladeshis who came here in like the 70s, and then Chinese international students, and then me.
Yeah, and then yeah, German international students and a kind of yeah, that sounds like a real kind of an interesting place for talking to people anyway. There's definitely a lot of influences there.
It was a culture shock for me on some level because I
Mm.
grew up in a small town, southwest England, called Poole.
Yeah.
And
Nice.
yeah, I grew up on a sort of estate on the edge of that town.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And how
yeah,
did you come to be in Berlin then? Was that something that just you just moved to Berlin?
I fell in love with a woman uh,
Nice.
who
Nice.
I
Always
met
good.
in London at a Rebel Wisdom summit a few years ago.
No way.
And she had also been interested in kind of the Jordan Peterson
Yeah.
intellectual dark web stuff, and
Yeah.
so was I.
Yeah.
And yeah, we ended up clicking a long time later, and then fell in love, and I moved out here,
Yeah.
and yeah, we got engaged about 3 weeks ago. So it's
Congratulations. Yeah, I saw that actually. That's really man, that's amazing. A huge kind of like what an exciting thing to be happening at a time where there's so much like,
yeah,
bullshit. At least there's something good going on, you know what I mean?
yeah,
I actually lived in Berlin for 2 years.
mm,
I moved there from Dublin, um, just because you can't after I finished uni. Similar kind of thing. I mean, in uni I studied philosophy and I studied economics, so I was always like philosophizing about just annoying people, just talking about it like all the time. But I kind of felt like after the 3 years, like I'd done loads of theoretical stuff, but like I was still a kid and I was still like
mm-hmm,
living the same life I had been living when I was 16 or 17. And there was no like people in Ireland, Dublin, really. I'd say in the UK, it's similar, just tend to live at home and they don't really, you go to uni and you don't move out. And it's kind of, you're still in your parents' house and you're like, ah, fuck, I'm still a kid. Like, but, so I
yeah,
moved to Berlin to kind of, experience the adult life and to kind of I suppose find myself as a bit of a cliche, but to live out and to I suppose um take that next step in life.
mm,
How do you find it as a place to live? I always it's it's such a fascinating place to be. I mean, there's there's so many different things in it we could talk about. But what is it that
Yeah,
interests you?
I'm also interested in like
Mm.
what was your dialogue with Berlin, having
Yeah.
lived there for 2 years?
Yeah.
Because I feel like I've had a conversation with
Mm.
Berlin since I
Mm.
arrived, and it's been probably a year, 3 months or something.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it was interesting for me because it was very tied up with the relationship and the future
Mm.
of the relationship, and we kind of
Yeah.
moved in together
Yeah.
in a pretty early stage.
Mm.
So there was times when I was like, sort of, what the fuck am I doing in
Yeah.
Berlin?
You're
And
in a
other
new country,
times,
new relationship, new. Yeah.
so it
Jeez.
was very psychedelic in that sense. My
Yeah.
perception of the place shifted.
Mm.
Um, Now I've been here for over a year. What to say? I'm very conscientious of the profanity of modern architecture.
Yeah.
And I also have a
That's
lot
a
of
good way to put
interest
it.
in collective trauma. And
Yeah.
so the two of those together is something that I experience very visually just walking around
Mm.
Berlin all the time.
It's almost like schizoid in the way it's like a different bits of different histories and cultures that have
Mm.
that are kind of embodied in the architecture, but also in like, I mean, it's such a strange place. I mean, me being an Irish guy living there, and there's a lot of Irish people there, but like I didn't meet that many German people. I mean, most of the people that I hung out with were all from like they're from Israel and Estonia and Spain and France and Ireland and
Wow.
England and like all these different kind of, you were almost inhabiting this city that had so much history around it, but it was all from expats or people, immigrants that I was hanging around with the whole time. So it was always kind of like a big playground of kind of like all these different, from history, but also then like clubs and nightlife and
Mm.
all that kind of stuff. Really old and new kind of clashing together in a,
Definitely.
yeah, very alive city. That's what I liked about it so much, was that there was just, it was inexhaustible, really, I thought.
So I arrived in summer of last
Mm.
year, in
Mm.
between COVID lockdowns,
Yeah.
when there was like a brief opening period
Yeah.
and then there was sort of a closing.
Yeah.
And so for
No.
me, like my girlfriend's
Mm.
fiance has lived here for like 5 years.
Mm.
So she'd constantly be telling me, oh, this is not like Berlin at all. This is not how it
Yeah.
usually is.
Yeah.
But for me, that's the only
Mm.
experience that it was like for like the first
Yeah.
10, 11 months.
Mm. That's so different
So,
because I mean when I was there, it was, oh, obviously there's a very big contrast between the winter and the summer, like the winter being this like barren wasteland of like minus 11 degrees and kind of like, I remember I lived in a house with no heating and I'd be wearing
fuck.
like 4 or 5 jumpers in winter just like under a blanket because you couldn't, it was just like nothing I'd ever experienced. But then the summer has been super hot and everybody's out in the park in Trep Tower or Gorlitzer, and there's music outside, there's people dancing, there's Sternbergs, it's like just a feast constantly. But I mean, if you haven't gotten to do that yet, it's such a weird time to be there, I suppose.
I've gotten bits of that.
Yeah.
And I certainly appreciate the good side of Berlin too.
Yeah. Mm.
Like, sunny days and people eating ice cream.
Yeah.
There's fucking tons of babies here. Like,
Yeah.
everyone's having babies.
I always thought it was a
Um,
weird place to have babies and to have kids and stuff, and like kind of but that's, I mean, that's kind of part of it because it can somehow house these different worlds, like that a
mm.
person can have a family and babies, and then there's like leather clad dominatrixes walking people down the street at like 7 in the morning. You're like, how do these things, how does this work? I don't, it's quite culturally,
Yeah.
it's very, it's just, yeah, it's got everything and it seems to work, which I like.
Everything except for a lot of unfettered nature inside the
Mm,
city. But
yeah.
that's a lot to ask of a city these days.
Yeah, I mean the parks and stuff they kind of hold it in, but like, yeah, I know what you mean, that it's quite like dense. And how have you found? I mean, this is where you've started your Dialogos practice, and
Mhm.
has Berlin? Have you found people more receptive there than maybe you would in England? Is there, because people might be more in that meaningful space? Do you think it's a good place for Dialogos? Is there? Is there stuff happening there?
There's definitely stuff happening in Germany. There is a team, Dr. Thomas Steininger, and an American woman that he works with, and they've been doing emergent dialogue in Germany in German for several
Mm,
years.
yeah.
Um, but for me in Berlin, it definitely has felt like a sort of would have relationships with people that weren't necessarily lasting and giving fruition.
Mm,
And I've developed a lot of, like, apart from my girlfriend who I
mm,
live with, many of the strongest relationships I've developed in the last year or 2 years have been somehow
yeah.
digitally mediated.
Yeah.
And also happen to converge on Dialogos as well.
Mm,
So yeah, it's been it's been something that sort of led me to find lots of really sort of serendipitously well connecting
mm,
relationships with people where, maybe people from religious backgrounds who are still like wrestling with that, and also
mm,
just the process of becoming embodied and grappling with the world as a young man. I think,
mm,
like, all of that stuff and has flowed in to these conversations where it's very much like bridging the contextual, emotional, embodied with the metaphysical, intellectual, large meta sort of
yeah, I think you kind of
approaches.
touched on it there. I was thinking that, like, I mean, the something I found in Berlin was the anomie of the place, to use a kind of
Mm.
outrageous word, but the kind of that there was there's so many people that it's very hard to form lasting connections, and a lot of time people are coming and going, and like you could be best friends with hanging out with somebody, but you won't even know their last name, and then they'll just disappear, and there's this kind of like constant chopping and shit. Like there's no, it's quite fast paced, and maybe big cities are like that, but it's interesting that you've touched on the Dialogos as making those connections as something that has allowed you, even in the pandemic, I suppose. And would these people be in Berlin, or would they be all over the world?
All over, yeah, California
Yeah,
and the UK mostly.
yeah. Mm. And do you find they're sustaining relationships? I mean, is it something? Are these digital relationships, a good substitute for the real life stuff as
Mm.
well?
I think it's it's becoming more and more real life for
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
Like, there's definitely a time when it wasn't, but gradually, like, the more I've sort of sought to bring this stuff out into my material world,
Yeah.
and sought to sort of allow some of those friendships to become collaborations in different ways,
Mm.
then it feels like it's become real and it is actually
Yeah.
sort of happening.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there is a distinction in friendship or relationship between those ones that are sort of once every month or once every several months
Mm.
or once every year. You have a conversation with somebody and it's like you get this awesome comparison point of not having seen each other for 3 months. So if you've been on a transformational process and going up, down,
Yeah.
when they see you, it's very much reflected back. Oh, like, you are changing and you're getting
Yeah.
closer to your goals and all of that.
Mm.
Um, but I've definitely lacked those, like, day to day bros, a
Yeah.
friendship group of just like hanging out,
Yep.
because it's been very transient. And so,
Yeah.
but I,
I
have
found
a great
exactly the
time with my
same.
girlfriend. So
Yeah. Mm.
we
I
make
found
our own
Berlin
world.
exactly like that as well, man, where it was very hard to form like close knit relationships in a way. Maybe because it is that kind of, and I'm sure it is possible. I mean, I have friends that have lived over there for many years. And maybe it's just part of growing up as well and leaving people behind. But something that you touched on there, which was the growth from Dialogos, the kind of like the transformational aspect. Because we did the Dialogos course together with John Vervaeke and Guy Sengstock, um, mixing the circling together with
Mm.
Dialogos, to kind of create this practice. for self transcendence and self development. And that kind of stuck out to me that John had said a thing where you've really changed when people say to you, "Hey, you've changed." It's not just when you think like you're like, "Oh, I figured out all this stuff," and you're like, "I know all these things now." Like when you leave university and you're like, "I've got all this stuff in my brain." It's when somebody actually goes, "No, there's something different about you. You're kind of like doing things this way." Is that something you notice with Dialogos? Is that something that sticks out to you?
Hmm. I guess, yeah, in the context of this question, Dialogos is kind of, um, it's like a tool or practice that sort of binds together a lot of other processes that are going on.
Mm,
So, um, yeah, I would say the growth process is kind of going on outside of Dialogos,
mm,
in life,
mm,
and working through the difficulties. And for me, coming out of a relationship with a lot of trauma and then
mm,
going through a lengthy period of integrating that was
mm,
something that really did change me,
mm,
in tandem with exploring psychedelics, in
mm,
tandem with developing a very deep relationship with nature,
yeah,
and
mm,
practicing like Vipassana meditation and doing yoga, and
yeah,
all those things together did have changed me. But yeah, I'd
yeah,
say it's maybe only now or in the near future that people are like clocking that. There's
yeah. That
definitely
people
like
are
a
kind of like,
lag on
"Oh yeah."
recognition.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing though, because sometimes you can feel like you have changed or you have kind of, I mean, a lot of what I write about is change and personal development and what that means, because there's such a big industry around it and everybody's trying to do it and everybody's trying to be the thing and the next big thing. And you kind of wonder like what's the end goal? What does the transformation look like? Where, because there doesn't seem to be a fixed point, but you can point it out and you can go, "Oh yeah, you're kind of like you're getting towards that thing a little bit more," but we can't describe it. I wonder, does Dialogos give us a way of kind of tapping into that transformational force, perhaps?
Yeah, I think so. I
Mm.
think it brings you to a horizon of knowing,
Yeah,
effectively. And wherever you are in your journey of self
yeah,
growth and transcendence, there will always be a horizon.
yeah.
And so, yeah, it's like your dialogue with that horizon, I suppose.
Mm. The
Um,
horizon is a good metaphor. I like that, like the edge of the known and the unknown. Peterson talks about that, like the place of meaning being the edge of what you know, where you meet the unknown, and then
right.
that's like the zone of proximal development, and that's where you got to be. And that's what he says about conversation as well, is that in a really good conversation, you're at that edge, where you're like trying to push further all of the time into the kind of the uncertain. Is there any practices that you use when you do Dialogos to try and get there? Do you just, is there, what's your compass, or do you think
Yeah,
about it?
I think in answering the question, I would also like speak to the directedness of the question.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
and whether it's not an interview where you're just in my practicing with me one to one,
yep.
my response would probably be to orient more towards a letting go of any set intention.
Mm,
And that's obviously connected with a lot of sort of Buddhist meditation and also psychedelic
yeah.
experience. Like in both of those contexts, there's a deep emphasis on the letting go,
Yeah.
or maybe like the breathing out.
Mm,
Um, yeah. And so I often will sort of break up the conversation
mhm,
with a meditation. Um, but then also like in the context, like it doesn't actually have to be, oh, we stop and have a 10-minute meditation now.
yeah.
It can just be a shift in tonality,
Mm,
which then um, intones the space, the we space,
mm.
differently, and it
How
can
would you
shift.
define the we space? Do you how would you describe that to somebody?
Yeah, we space is a term from those the emergent dialogue team in Germany that I talked about.
Mm,
For me, collective mind is probably more where it's at.
mm,
It's sort of an emergent collective mind
yeah.
that we connect
Mm-hmm,
with others. It can also be called collective intelligence, but for me, a sense of a mind that gradually sort of gathers, or a
mm,
field.
mm-hmm,
Um, and it can have different qualities depending on who's participating and how they're participating, and
mm,
like what moves are made in the conversation, and all of that sort of transforms the background.
mm-hmm. And is it related to distributed cognition? Kind of made me think of that there. But in terms of, I suppose, the it being a kind of third force acting on the two people in the conversation. Like I thought about that in the course, was a sense that when we were doing the fellowship, when we were speaking with each other and you were trying to engage this kind of serendipity, or this kind of, where you felt like there was something else guiding the conversation. It wasn't just your conscious intention being pushed onto it. You were allowing kind of a sort of a serendipity to emerge and to structure the conversation. Um, is that anywhere? Is that just anywhere close to what you're thinking, or is it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And just, yeah, with regards to like distributed cognition, there is a very strong like systems thinking, sense making
Hmm.
influence on the language
Yeah.
and everything sort of, to sort of pitch to fast paced, techie corporate life. It becomes necessary to describe things in these really cool
Yes.
sci fi ways, like just self organizing collective
Cognitions and
intelligence. And,
yes. Yep.
but, in the context of Dialogos, in the context of that move from like two individuals coming, and then there's sort of a gathering together of, um, the field that exists between those two.
Mm,
But then there is this third movement where the collective mind or the
mm,
field takes on a momentum, and we could even say a telos or direction
mm,
of its own.
mhm,
Um, and that experience can be like many different threads from different parts of your life and
mm.
pieces of information that you know. It's as if the flow in the center between the participants kind of draws in things which correspond and connect with one another.
And that they're drawn together in such a way that it allows you to process them, or to kind of see connections between them. Um, I mean, it. I'm trying to think of what the effect is in terms of when I was experiencing that when we were doing the discussions. Um, Almost similar to with psychedelics, which was a sense of a presence of something other than your own, maybe
Mm.
that whatever kind of, it could be a religious argument or whatever, but I'm not really making any metaphysical argument. It's just a pure phenomenological experience of a force in the conversation other than your own will and the other person's will acting on it, and that it's become involved in the conversation in a way. And maybe I wonder if there's a part of the Dialogos is going with that rather than going against it. Maybe that could be, if you weren't aware of that, you could shy away from that aspect of the conversation, whereas the Dialogos pushes you towards it. Do you think that is a fair assessment?
I would say invites
Ah, okay.
toward.
Yeah.
Like I noticed that you described it as like there's kind of a force, and then there's the two wills, and then the force is somehow like conforming or something
Yeah.
their wills.
Mm,
we could shift that language in another way. And um, for me, it's really a spirit.
Yeah, that's the word.
That's the word
Logos.
for me to describe what Dialogos is. It's a spirit, and it's a really musical sort of
Mm.
event,
Yeah.
um,
Interesting way of putting it.
experience.
Yeah.
And I'd definitely be interested. I'm very interested in the connections with what occurs in psychedelic
Mm.
mystical experience. And um, it's interesting, like that sense of an entity or an other is not one that I had right away
Mm.
when I was first exploring psychedelics with LSD. Um, there was a sort of self dissolution and deep insight into nature, and it was a very perceptually time
Mm.
shifting sort of experience. I'm
Mm-hmm.
very curious. Um, it was only quite far into that journey
Mm.
with psilocybin
That's
that
very
I
interesting. That was exactly what I
experienced,
was thinking.
the larger, like a very, very embodied sense of dissolution
Mm.
rather than just a sort of cerebral. It was very much like
Mm.
the heart body melt
Mm.
outwards. And it's in the context of psilocybin that I've experienced a sense of like, oh, this, like, Tim McKenna used to always talk
Yeah.
about, it sets the agenda. And like this, like,
Yeah.
it's got a kind of sexual, like erotic,
Yeah. Mm.
and that's something that has only begun to make sense to me very recently.
Mm. That's something
Seeing it
I
as a
completely with psilocybin was what I was going to say, more so than I suppose it is a relatable experience in terms of the spirit or something that I guess, I mean, that seems to come down so much to the psychedelic experience, why it benefits people. Like so much of I think it's Roland Griffiths and his work and John Hopkins has been the experience of that there's another, that there's something larger than yourself. Terence McKenna might have called it the vegetable mind or the kind of this, what was it? He said that we're trapped inside of a big work of art. He called it like that this kind of, that there is another than this material interaction of bodies, that there, and that you can phenomenologically experience that in a way reliably with these compounds. And that was kind of his argument, was that the proof is in the pudding. You can take it and do it, and then this is what happens. But I think a lot of people are resistant to that. So Dialogos maybe offers a way of doing that that's a bit more maybe closer to home for people. You think that's fair?
definitely, yeah, you're getting spot on with something that's very alive for me, which
Mm.
is um, that I've had the experience that the people
Mm.
with cancer getting the 4 gram, 4.5 gram dose. I've
Mm.
had that magnitude of experience.
Mm.
Um, but the idea that psychedelics are going to spread, at least in the way that Terence McKenna and people talked about at that time, I think is
Mm.
not quite how it's going to go.
Yeah,
And I
yeah, I
think it's
kind of.
more like the people who do use psychedelics use it as medicine, however you want to describe that sort of shamanic journey. Um, those people then become free of a lot of blockages that are preventing them from becoming greater
Mm.
artistically, creatively.
Mm-hmm.
The boundary dissolving quality of these substances tends to make connections between different paradigms of thought and experience that haven't yet been connected.
Mm.
Um, and I believe Dialogos can have a very gentle, solvent quality on the boundaries of human thought by bringing us into relationship with our own edge and
Mm.
combining meditation, combining a sort of free form journey that you go on, and neither person knows where it's going to go. And therein lies the recipe for its success as a Dialogos.
And the transformative quality as well, I suppose. That's because the word I would have used to describe the course that we did and the type of conversation and the type of experience that it was psychedelic. I didn't really have another word to describe it, just in the sense that it opened my mind up to possibilities that I wasn't aware of. And that kind of experience blows apart your conceptual structure a bit. It shows you where you're kind of the boundaries of your known and unknown that we talk about. And I think for a lot of people, we become very submerged in the known, and something like that can remind you that there is an unknown in the first place. I think you can pretend the world is very, very simple just by acting in accord with what you know, as long as that works to a certain extent. But I think things are breaking down a lot in our culture and are breaking down a lot in general. So more and more people are being confronted with the bad side of the unknown rather than this more genteel, adventurous side of it. And so I guess what I'm arguing is that there's kind of a solution of sorts in the Dialogos, the potential for that. Does that
Yeah,
make, does that seem
yeah,
equitable?
yeah, yeah. I'm noticing in myself as I'm listening, and there's such a breadth of territory that there's almost like a relevance realization process where I'm trying
Yeah.
to figure like how do I best, because there's many different like forms that I could take depending on what I chose to speak about and how I chose to
Yeah.
move. Um, and I don't really know like what the audience is for
Yeah.
this as such.
Yeah.
So yeah, for me, I had to sort of just let go of that
Yeah.
and just engage with you and see where it goes.
Mm.
Um,
See if we can get to that edge of where we kind of have to step over and kind of realize something slightly different. And I guess that's kind of maybe why I brought in the culture thing a little bit, because I suppose you've grown up in a culture similar to mine and perhaps felt the lack in it. I wonder, is that what has inspired you, like it's inspired me to take on these problems?
yeah, I appreciate the sense of like similarity of background connection here,
Mm.
even though my accent and culturally I'm quite American.
Mm.
I grew up in a very, very English family and on an estate and went to
Yeah.
school, and everybody was sort of lower middle class or middle class. And, kids would go to the town center after school and all of that sort of
Yeah.
stuff. And I saw the art project that you did, the estate.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I
Well,
was kind of
that's, man, it's
connecting with that.
exactly about that type of lifestyle and the, yeah, I mean, what you touched on previously, the higher path. I mean, there's something about this type of conversation that's reminding people that there is a higher path, because I don't think everybody is knows that or is encouraged towards it. To say that, we all have a right to pursue that higher path. It's something actually that, as a human individual, is, you really are important in regards to it. I mean, it doesn't happen unless you pursue it. And I like the democratic aspect of Dialogos, which is that everyone can do it. I mean, you it's not like a prerequisite to be a superstar or something. It's, you can, you know, it's available for everybody that wants to open up and to talk and to explore that kind of way.
Yeah, it's at its at its best, I think it's a non-rivalrous sort of infinite
Mm.
game
Mm.
in the same way that music, with maybe with exception to some rap, generally the enterprise of music making is like a collaboration, whether it's like a band or whether it's like, oh, you don't need to compare two great artists because
Mm.
it's like, no, we can just have more great artists and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. Um, and it depends. Like, I get listening to your essay on redemption and the meaning crisis, which I really enjoyed and
Thank you.
has sort of inspired me to like think maybe I could read some of my essays
Yeah. So,
in that way.
mm.
Yeah, I sort of connect with, like, I feel like there is a very unique Irish contextual version of the meaning crisis. And there's
Yeah.
sort of this very immediate like shift away from the Catholicism
Yeah.
of the previous generation. And I've had a few Irish friends over the years and sort of got a sense for that.
Mm.
Um, and trying to figure out an answer to that, and just like there was so much awfulness and rigidity and oppression involved in the religious way of the previous generations, and yet like the sort of monks and the whole longer lineage of
Mm.
Christianity in Ireland is pretty vast and significant.
Yeah.
And then I don't know, there's probably some Celtic stuff before that.
Paganism. Yeah. Well, I think we've kind of
Paganism.
just gone back to paganism, would be my kind of argument. That well, if you take away that, I mean, I was raised completely secular, so but I grew up in a parish, so I grew up around, uh, like in a Catholic area, but without a religion. Which made me really interested in this stuff. I was just like a rabid atheist, like so bad, like would just
Same.
savage people all the time. That was like, I was so defensive and so like, ah. But just because that became the religion, I suppose, that I was told, like you get this belief and non-belief, and you end up, it's there's nothing different between a religion and just a value system. And you need, the argument that I made in that particular piece was that you need a value system in order to pay attention to things. You know, what's salient to you is what you find valuable. So what's salient stands out from the background. And we all have that kind of operating system. So it's about what's the best salience landscape. How do you make it more sophisticated? And my argument is that religions and spiritualities are, and even things like virtue ethics or philosophies, are ways of trying to civilize that process, saying, look, you know, you might want this, but this is actually a better thing to want, and give you an ability to negotiate between them, because we don't actually have that naturally. I think that's a cultural device, and when we just work off pure biology, it's a kind of like hedonism or paganism. That's like the default. It was, as Jonathan Haidt said, we're not scientific thinkers, we're religious thinkers that can think scientifically. You know, it's something we develop through discipline. But if you just take away all of that for everybody and we don't have a culture anymore, people default, and you end up with this weird kind of cultish thing going on with all these rival gangs, basically, of whose team are you on. And everything gets it. Terence McKenna called it the balkanization of epistemology. It was that sense
Hmm.
making just is destroyed, and everybody has this individual world that doesn't make sense with anybody else's, and we're all like shattered glass trying to put it back together. But yeah, that's, I don't know where I was going with that, but that was kind of what that essay was about, really.
That's very prescient of Terence McKenna to our
Yeah, that
current
was in
circumstance.
1995 as well, or something like that. So he was ahead of the curve. But
It's something I've wondered about with people like McKenna and people like Nietzsche,
mm,
who was so prescient of trends,
mm,
whether there isn't a kind of way in which these philosophers and mystics could get so deep into the present that
mm,
they would somehow become a part of the rhythm that was running from the
yeah,
past into the future,
yeah,
and therefore
mm,
they could kind of, yeah, see larger trends and larger arcs playing
mm,
out. And that's something that um, psychedelics definitely opened me up to, but then like this more ongoing collective dialogue, wisdom, like this emerging wisdom school
Yeah.
around Dialogos and some
Mm.
other things that has really equipped me really well. And like the conversations that I have had with Guy and John and others, you know, only having one or two was still very, very significant for me.
Mm.
And I think getting to engage with somebody like that, like I receive a download, if you will,
Yeah.
of a wisdom, and it's not necessarily a propositionally held thing. And
Mm.
I don't actually know what it is right away, but it's something about like the way that they related to me,
Mm.
the way that I was disclosed in the sense that they can see me in ways that I can't yet see myself.
Mm.
And um, yeah, it's in the sense of value systems. I almost see this distinction between like the mystics, let's say, and the religious, and the mystics are somehow going to the source of all value systems
Mm-hmm.
and then like being conformed to that
Mm-hmm.
and becoming more deeply participating with life in a way that is somehow wise as a consequence of their relationship to um, God or divine unity or whatever.
Through their understanding of that, and then they can give it back to us in a sense. I mean, that's like
That
kind of the Stoic thing, isn't it? The sage, and you do what you imitate the ideal sage in your own life, and then that's how you cultivate wisdom through this kind of higher order kind of moral principle, I suppose, that you put above yourself, and that we emulate that, and then that's how we learn it through kind of mimicry, I suppose. But yeah, I guess I felt growing up that there was a lack of that. I think the internet has made it more possible to see guys like John and Guy, and to meet yourself, and to see Jordan Peterson, to see the whole meaningful space that's kind of that is emerging it as a kind of counterculture to the counterculture. Um, so it's like, which is pretty cool, but that didn't really exist previous to, like, you know, mid 2000s. I wonder, did you have these influences when you were before that? I mean, was there, you know, or is this kind of a digital thing? Is that what's driving the movement?
um, well, personally for me, I'll note that I felt very drawn to the counterculture from a young
Yeah.
age. Growing up in England, I was always drawn to like that sort of late 60s
Yeah.
time and this sort of cross
Me too.
pollination and
Yep.
everything that was going on, the anti war movement and
Mm.
psychedelics. And, um, but I think it's also important that my dad was kind of very Christian and a minister to a Christian community,
Mm.
um, which was pretty like a young Christian community.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so maybe for the first 8 or 9 years of my life, there was just this sort of community context
Mm.
relationally where my parents just had all these different friends who were people in their church.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so
And did you become secular after that? I mean, at
yeah,
what point?
yeah,
Yeah.
I, I think I really believed in some of the stuff that my dad was, you know, speaking to me as a child and like connecting me with, and it was quite like fantastical. Like I
Mm.
really, when I was in like sixth, seventh grade, like I believed in these sort of realms of
Yeah.
angels and demons, and
Yeah.
I thought it would be very cool to be an exorcist when I grew up, and that seemed
Wow.
like a badass kind of
That would be
thing when
pretty
I was.
badass.
But
Mm.
um, yeah, my parents kind of withdrew from the church that they were involved in, so I wasn't involved in that, and then I was just involved with school, and the school is Catholic, and we would go to the local church sometimes, and it was all of those elements that have left an entire generation bereft of and sort of in rejection of religion.
Yeah.
Just an empty recapitulation of things that, like, the teachers think it would be a good idea to say it to the students, but don't themselves
Don't even
live it.
understand it, or
And
yeah.
yeah, there was just a sense, like, having come from a very unique Christian context at a young age, and then being in that sort of school context, it was like I could see through the bullshit of
Yeah.
it. It felt like,
Yeah.
um, and then gradually I did become like new atheist as I grew older.
Yeah.
Um, and then it probably wasn't until I first tripped acid that
Yeah.
I began to, like, that just reintroduced the unknown in
Mm.
such a big way. And then gradually that began to catalyze
Yeah.
a growth process and realization. And, like, through the midst of that, seeing all these, like, shadows from the past and, like, integrating all of that.
Mm. Shadows in the past, in sense of your own shadows, your own kind of life, or the collective experience?
I think for me, there was a lot of emotions that were just held unconsciously.
Mm.
So it's like my personality rested upon something, and then underneath it was this whole body
Mm.
of stuff that I hadn't confronted. Just like growing up in an English family and
Mm-hmm.
all of the emotional trauma that comes from a culture of the First World War and the Second World War, like literally just having happened, and that was like 2 generations ago,
Mm-hmm.
and they sort of came back into a very
Mm-hmm.
repressed and very sort of class differentiated culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm like, I see myself as sort of the descendant in a way of that,
Yeah.
industrialization and all of those
Yeah.
things. And so when I was tripping acid, it felt like I wasn't just dissolving my disembodiment and my cutoff from mystery. It was also like, oh, there's many layers
Yeah.
in the code that have to be sort of
That's
reconnected with.
fucking fascinating, man. Like, in the sense that I've always thought that like as an individual, you're also like an emblem of your culture that you grow up in. So a lot of times people say, through activism you should change the culture and stuff, but you're also a unit of culture in that way. I mean, you're shaped by the forces that created it. Like in my case as well, like I live in the north of Ireland, and a lot of my background is from Belfast and things like that. So there's a lot of difficulties there from the troubles in the 70s. And I guess everybody has that, because your parents grow up with their parents and they grow up with their parents, and it's flawed people all the way down. So you kind of inherit a lot of stuff, a lot of wisdom and a lot of bad stuff as well, and then kind of trying to put that together into, to make sense of it in your own personality. I think also because our generation don't have that structure anymore. We've kind of had to, that process of making yourself is also making that structure. Does that make any sense? If like you don't have that cultural backdrop, you don't have the luxury of just being Catholic or being against Catholicism. We're kind of having to do another thing, I think, which
Yeah.
is maybe
Yeah.
funny. Yeah, like
That's spot on.
we got to do something else. Like it's kind of our time to do that other thing. But I guess that's maybe what I'm
Yeah.
trying to hit on.
And I think in order to do that, there's like there's kind of you have to almost dwell in the reality of,
Mm,
like, what that must have been like
mm,
for your ancestors,
mm,
and connect with that, um, to sort of bring it through to this sort of question of the world right now and the incapacity to make sense of it, and um, respond to it well, and the exponentiality of change.
yeah.
I think that those layers of disconnection from the past cut us off from our bodies, and
Mm,
in doing so, from our senses and from our actual felt relationship to complexity.
Hmm.
And so we actually only encounter complexity in a phenomenological, experiential way.
Mm.
Um, and this, I think, begins to account for why there's such a alienation from nature
Mm.
and just like
From
not.
our own nature as well. I mean, not just the forest, but also our own, who we are, and our drives and our heritage, I suppose, as mammals and as children, and this kind of alienation from the past and our culture. That's something which I felt very keenly growing up, was just like no foundation, like not, you know, if you reject all of the past and all of the culture as corrupt and tyrannical and everything, you don't stand on anything. You're kind of you're like, you've sawn off the branch you're sitting on. So it's kind of, it's it's not a position, it's not somewhere you can start from, I think. So that dealing with the past is kind of, for me, the beginning of living now. It's the beginning of actually, you know reforming
Mhm.
yourself.
Yeah.
Mm. That's the way I think. I mean, that's something really, like, I don't know, maybe it's for millennials or other ones, but it's every generation probably has issues with the generation before them and with the other ones in the context. But I think in the 2000s and this kind of 21st century, it's really weird. Like, there isn't a um there's no set menu to eat from. So we're all having to kind of become chefs, and we're all kind of shit at it. And we need we need a bit more like collective sense making, um, collective cooking. I don't know if that metaphor works, but
Yeah, something about needing tastes as well.
yeah,
Um,
and nutrition as well.
and nutrition. Yeah, to try and thread that that not being with the past fully shows up as like the politics of rejection or resentment, and
Yeah.
ultimately as a feeling and as a psychic state that is kind of stuck, and it's not going to be able to flow and change, and it's certainly not going to survive a high dose of psychedelics either. um,
Yeah.
and that's something that I had definitely sensed in like Irish culture in relationship to me as an Englishman in the past. I did tune into this sense of like, oh, like I, the Irish person, am the resentful victim, and you are the culture of oppression.
Yeah.
But
That's
actually,
yeah.
I see being like the paradigm of being working class in English
Mm,
is just as oppressive as
yeah.
any
But
other
that's, I
kind of
mean, if you
system.
come to, I mean, if you come to believe those, because I mean, in part, there obviously is truth about that in terms of class struggles and the oppression of Ireland by England and colonialism and stuff. But if you come to identify yourself by that, you end up in a very weird psychological position, because you're not really equivalent to that struggle. You know what I mean? Something with Irish nationalism a lot. All right, you can end up with, you reject everything that's English like. So you reject authority, you reject, discipline, you'll reject order, you'll kind of fall into more this kind of rebellious role. And in a sense, you pigeonhole yourself, because I mean, it, while these things are real historical events, they're not real historical events to us all the time. You might experience them, but they're also representations of something. You're kind of,
Mm.
if you take them into yourself and you act from them, it'll give you a type of personality. It'll shape your character in a way. And so I think these competing stories that we have in the culture wars and things like that have left everybody scrambling for something like that, because it makes sense of who you are now. You know what I mean? If I define myself as an Irish person, as oppressed by the English and everything, that sets goals for me. That tells me how to act. That tells me who I am in and my values and everything. It allows me to orient myself, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right way of orienting myself. And that's kind of the argument, I think. You know, what is the right way of, what's the right story? Which one makes sense? And we have this huge competition going on between
Yeah. My answer is which one makes music
them. Yeah,
on some level.
but yeah, music in the sense of harmony. I mean,
Hmm.
which one causes endless violence and chaos, and which one actually creates homeostasis and something we can live in? That's kind of the test, isn't it? And I suppose in my own life, I feel like I've found that because I've lived the 70s counterculture thing, partying, doing drugs, fuck everybody. I'm an atheist. You know, this is all bullshit. Science is right. Everybody's an idiot. I did that, but it didn't work, and it didn't make me. I didn't feel aligned with myself or with. I didn't feel like I was in the right place with it. I mean, a lot of causes a lot of negative emotions and a lot of conflict, and I guess I wonder if we can find the ideal again.
Yeah, you spoke to like a wisdom path earlier, and I wanted to sort of suggest that that path is so individual in a
Yeah.
certain way to
Mm.
each of us,
Yeah.
and contextual as
Mm.
well,
Yeah.
that it's less about something that we can write down on 10 commandments or
Yeah. A dogma.
something like that, and it's more an actual felt sense of alignment or flow
Mm.
or
Flow.
musicality, because that's what it's become
Yeah.
for me, is like with
Yeah.
more not knowing,
Mm.
there has to be more flowing.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I'd heard John Vervaeke say before, like, if you can tell how much meaning a person has in their life by how much flow they have, by how much flow state they're experiencing. That there's a direct correlation between being at the edge of your known and your experience of meaning and the flow state. That's a way of, you know,
Yeah. And it's also, I think, for me, it's been one of the healing things of that
mm,
process of self integration,
mm,
is doing things that felt like they got me in flow,
mm,
whether it was cannabis and nature, cannabis yoga,
yeah,
or um, yeah, when I came across Dialogos, that was like sick. This is a
yeah,
flow inducing participatory thing
yeah,
that I just
yeah,
love to watch, and I love being
yeah,
the fourth wall
yeah,
on Guy and John and Jordan Hall and all of and Christopher.
mm,
So yeah, it's like an honor for me to get to be able to talk to people like that, and that's that was sort of my highest aspiration setting out with the podcast, is like I want to live a life where I get to speak with the most interesting people,
yeah,
but consequentially you have to become an interesting person as well, and
yeah.
you have to
I know
become
that.
more uh, engaging and more able to like, yeah, it's that sort of not knowing in relationship to complexity that would allow you to jump on with somebody you've never met
Yeah,
and just go for it and
mm,
gradually get a sense for each other
mm,
in dialogue. And then you can actually sort of do a work. Like we are kind of, we've been creating
yeah,
something here gradually as
mm.
we've explored.
And that you can kind of the willingness to do that, I suppose, it requires probably a journey in itself as well. I don't know if that would be, I know a long time ago in my life, I wouldn't have had perhaps the confidence or the even be at the developmental stage to do something like this where you can jump into the conversation. So I suppose for podcasts and things like that, it serves as an example for people to be like, hey, anybody can do it. You just have to be brave and you got to give it a shot and talk to strangers on the internet, like that's actually a good thing to do in a weird way. But so I mean, what we've kind of been dancing around here, what I was really interested in the beginning is Dialogos as an answer to the meaning crisis, as an answer to you know, the cultural conflict, not as an answer where you say this is the answer, but as a way of generating answers, as a method rather than a package. Um, And have you seen that in your clients that you work with? I mean, does it decrease this anomie? Is it something that offers a solution to it?
Yeah. It does for
Yeah,
me.
yeah,
It has for the people that I've been in like long-term dialogue relationships with.
mm,
Um, it it's astonishing, but you keep coming back, and the reservoir is always full in a
mm,
certain way, and so
mm,
it's something nourishing that I can keep coming back to,
mm,
and yeah, it connects me with a felt sense of meaning, like a felt sense
yeah,
of alignment. And
mm,
it's less that I mean, it is incredibly generative. Like I was saying, that sort of solvency and bringing together things that haven't been brought together before
mm,
is so you're sort of playing with and participating in the primordial creative forces of life in a
yeah,
dialogos.
mm,
Um, but I actually think it's more about your instrument in relationship with your life,
mm,
and so it creates a greater conformity, or like you become more tuned as an instrument in your process of, you know, paying attention to your life and responding to relationships, and how quickly do you move out of being like in a shit state or in a depressive state or in an anxious state or in a state of really like limiting beliefs and self-indulgent doubts?
mm,
How quickly can you move out of that and back into alignment? That's sort of the lived question for me right now. And I feel like I focus much more on alignment than I do on the actual products and
yeah.
what flows out of that.
And that you kind of learn, that's really exactly what I'm thinking, even in terms of doing the podcast and the type of conversations that I have this last month and not doing it. I've really missed it. And I felt like it's such a tool for attunement, for that feeling of connection with one person. And then that you take that out into the rest of your life, that you walk around with it in a sense. And it helps you, it tunes you up to things that otherwise you just kind of drift by. And maybe if you haven't had that experience, similar to psychedelics, I suppose, you don't really know what that means. You know, you have to kind of go through it in order to have context.
Yeah, I've come out of Dialogos calls and like produced songs like
Yeah,
immediately after I've
yeah,
come out, and like gone immediately into like confronting some like really challenging emotional complex issue that someone's having, and just being in like being with that flow,
mm,
um, not having to totally think about it, it is just affording of a capacity for me to respond to life
mm,
that is far superior than my own capacities.
mm. And that it's a way that reliably does it as well. Even though there's no like way to do it, you can still kind of aim at that outcome, I suppose. It comes, even though there's no like recipe for this, you say this and you do this and then you move like this and that does this. It can still be done reliably in a sense, which is kind of like the psychedelic experience, where it's always different and it always has the other context, but it reliably produces these changes in your who you are.
Yeah, yeah. I can't say yeah. Every single trip for me has
Mm,
been transformative in some way. It
mm,
always is, but you don't necessarily know right away because it's sort of it feels like it happens sort of at the deeper levels of your conscious being,
mhm.
and then gradually what's on the surface will change over time.
Yeah.
Um,
And do you use
Dialogos.
psychedelics for Dialogos? Is that something that you, or is it just in the philosophy of it?
I have not. Um, yeah, I would not recommend it.
Mm.
Certainly not on Zoom anyway,
Yeah. I
because
don't know if I could type. It'd be very difficult. organize
psychedelic
that.
trips are very energetically costly, and so it's
Yeah.
best to sort of keep a more enclosed set and setting with whoever I'm with and all of that. But they have 100% transformed me and therefore transformed the way that I participate in dialogue.
Hmm.
Um, I did sort of have some rituals when I started out for Sensespace. Like I would always smoke some cannabis, go out into nature,
Hmm.
and go like walking in nature. And that was sort of like my way of getting the best clear
Hmm.
mind where I wasn't, or to the least extent possible, was not so nervous and not like
Hmm.
premeditating what was going to happen, because
Yeah.
my monologic mind would be like
Yeah.
planning the conversation and like
Yeah.
playing out.
Yeah.
And so just getting back to that, like not knowing direct
Mm.
experience and sort of getting restful in that
Mm.
is my best sort of preparatory recipe.
That just reminded me so much of like the thing that I noticed in the course a lot was that I shifted my mindset from like prepared speech, where like this is the speech that I'm giving, I know the or I have an outcome for this talk, to just being like the way I thought about it was like being empty, listening, and then go. Like it was just like no outcome. I'm not thinking about what I want to try and produce or anything. It's just a process of emptying, feeling, and then speaking. Like it wasn't, there was no direct, you know, I wasn't trying to get to a particular goal or a particular outcome. And that for me was very, number one, very different to normal speech. I would say a lot of the time you can get caught very much in like trying to navigate the world and get your way and kind of speak to people in an instrumental way. So this kind of other mode of communicating is, I think, a lot more meaningful and a lot more risky. Maybe, I suppose it has a very, that's probably the anxiety of it, is that it's very uncontrollable. Like you have to say the things that bubble up and the images and be very willing to be authentic.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. That's very well put. Um, it's a creative act of speech when you get to that edge and you don't know what you're going to say next.
Mm.
It's very much the same to me as picking up a guitar and just starting playing around and then sort of tuning yourself into a rhythm as you go.
Mm.
Um, and I sort of discovered music making around, during the time that I was practicing Dialogos as well. So maybe they sort of intermesh, but it's the foundation of psychoanalysis with Jung and Freud was all about getting people to talk in free association. And in so doing, the analyst could sort of understand the mind and get a sense for the patterns of the mind and all of this stuff. And so there is a vulnerability to it because you are disclosing the style of your
Mm.
mind, maybe rather than the content, like the style is going to
Yeah.
come through. Um,
And you're giving up the filter in a way as well. I mean, you're kind of giving up thinking of that Freudian censor that says, don't do that, do this, the super ego kind of thing. You're kind of saying, we're going to take that off for a while and see what happens, which is pretty radical, I suppose.
it's fucking awesome. Yeah. I mean, when I started out, there were these milestones of like talking about pornography addiction, talking about
Yeah.
my experience with psychedelics. And
Yeah.
each time that was like, oh, this huge thing. And
Yeah.
I thought the
Mm.
world would be up in arms or something. But actually, each time near to nothing happened.
Yeah.
And I had just like made myself a little more myself by connecting what's inside with the outside world.
Yeah.
That has made
Bonus
me
ones.
more present just
Mm.
through the process of doing that over time.
And that there's something so powerful about that, saying those things that you don't usually say, or something that I really noticed when we did the Dialogos thing when I was in my group and we were kind of doing the fellowship, and you'd take turns to each say something, and even just describing just the, like when somebody would say something, the exact image or feeling that that gave to me. without any editing of any sort, or any like, oh, what will they think about
Right.
this, or what will this do, like will they all just go, oh fuck you, get out of here, man, that's terrible, what are you doing, and saying and just relaying that information and the excitement that that creates, because everybody goes,
Yeah.
holy shit, that's actually what's going on inside of you. And then they go, here's what's actually going on inside of me. And you go, holy shit, that made me go like this. And they have this like back and forth. And it's just like, it's so nourishing. It's so, but so absent most of the time. I mean, in terms of, there's a lot of formality in day-to-day life, I think, that this kind of strips away and gets you in contact with that raw material.
Yeah. I think it really has that live play quality to it.
Yeah.
And it's like I've been having a lot of insights recently about sort of the idea of performance
Mm.
and authenticity is like they're often held up in our culture to be separate,
Yeah.
and bringing those two together
Mm.
in the context of Dialogos, something that Christopher Mastro Pietro said is that we don't speak the truth, we perform what's true.
Mm.
And
Totally.
so, like, in order to become better instruments in Dialogos, we have to more truly perform what's true for us. And yeah, that is just doing that thing of like, oh, this is actually what's coming up for me
Yeah.
in this moment, and not giving a fuck about anything apart from just playing in this self-aware space with someone. That can actually just like really stir the pot, you know. Like if
Yeah.
you do that and then it corresponds with something else, you both might discover something,
Mm.
um or some like serious, like that is sort of the transformational edge space in many ways.
Yeah, it just reminded me of the Jordan Peterson, was it courageous truth in the service of love, and that there's this the reason you don't speak the truth is because the truth changes everything. It just like, if you were to say exactly what's going on, things are going to be different. You can't keep the status quo in a sense if you're just, because you don't know what's going to happen if you just say exactly what that is. And the fact that Dialogos creates a space where that can occur kind of gives you that opportunity again, and that you can integrate into your own life and integrate into other areas, and yeah, to perform truly in the sense of the truth. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and there's a
Yeah.
real like vastness of potential for
Mm.
me
A new
that
mode of being as well is what came up for me, because I've been searching for that, a new mode of being, in the sense that I felt like I'd kind of run out, or during the pandemic I kind of burned out, and I was really like, just felt the need for transformation. I went back to counseling, started doing psychotherapy, um, and those types of conversations are very much that, very similar to that, I suppose, in a one-sided sense, but also I suppose in a dialogical setting, but that it offers a new mode of being that's not focused on, you know, I hate the word, but I suppose productivity or something like that, but that it's more about being, and that has something to do with being. I don't know if I've made the connection, but
totally. And I think like even to distinguish the therapy versus Dialogos a little more, um, like in the context of therapy, people can go and they can share a lot with somebody who's going to sort of listen and observe and then sort of make their own map of what's going on, but they're not necessarily sharing that, and there's a kind of
yeah.
analytical boundary. And so the effect of that can be that the person who's sharing and like getting all their stuff out isn't actually learning how to relate well with another human being
Mm.
through the relationship with the therapist,
Mm-hmm.
because that relationship can be a bit of an aberration. And also in the context of the broader scheme of things, it's like a very recent thing that's been stacked on secular culture, but actually is, you know, the ground of interpersonal transformation, I think, has to be connected with metaphysics and all of that.
That's really interesting, connecting it with the secular thing, because in a sense, I feel like Dialogos does democratize that kind of transformational ability in conversation, which has become very focused in psychology. I think a lot of the psychology is picking up the slack for a lot of religious structures that have fallen apart. Even the idea of confession, I mean, it's kind of the same thing.
Right.
You
Yeah,
know,
there's
going out and being
deep,
truthful somewhere,
a
somebody that
deeply similar, isn't it?
yeah, and that there's a kind of cathartic element to it that you have to go and say what's going wrong and speak it out loud, and that. But I like the idea of that can be done more effectively, that there isn't a monopoly on it, you know what I mean, in one particular profession, that's actually a human thing, which I think is what Jung gets at a lot when he says, that a lot of psychotherapy could be removed by moral courage and by, caring, and that it's something we could, like, I don't think it's reasonable for absolutely everybody to be in therapy. I mean, it might be a good thing, but surely there needs to be some sort of social thing that picks up the slack on that. You know, why do we all feel so disconnected that that's how we have to connect? That's how where we have to go. Feels feels like it's filling a void.
Yeah, and not only avoid, but generations of dysfunction
Yeah.
and like not even having the language or the context to make sense of any of that. And so it is a peer to peer cultural technology. And it's very much of the, where two or more are gathered in my name, I am with them kind of thing,
Yeah.
except you swap out the Holy Spirit for the spirit of the Logos. Um,
Mm.
that's a very, very different paradigm of understanding to the paradigm of 20th century scientific
Mm.
rationalist psychotherapy.
Yeah, and also, I mean, that the psychotherapy is tapping into that, something that it does always seem like that it's through psychotherapy that ancient wisdom and religious ideas will make their way back into the mainstream. Like, it's through psychology, because we realize that those things play such a key role in what we define as mental health, that there isn't really, I mean, mental health is an ideal. I always wonder about that, where it's like, you know who is the mentally healthy person, who is the most mentally healthy, what's like, what am I aspiring to when I'm aspiring to be mentally healthy? There's a kind of a, you're like,
Yeah.
well, that's not a scientific ideal, it's not a scientific definition. So you're kind of left with, well, it's going to end up rebuilding some sort of religious structure, because you're positing a higher order aim. So I don't know. I guess I feel like that's kind of the transformation that's coming about. And you see it with guys like John Vervaeke, obviously cognitive scientist involved in psychology, Jordan Peterson, psychologist, Jung, a lot of guys that in that tradition see the ancient wisdom as the ultimate psychology, that you know, it, it, it's a technology for creating people that are well situated in life if used properly.
I think I could riff for another hour on the archaic the archaic revival and
Well, that's kind of what I'm getting at. So Terence McKenna, the transcendental hyper object, the end of time.
definitely have engaged a lot with that stuff, and
Mm,
I like to bring in that really some of McKenna's really radical ideas and
yeah.
put them together with this more well structured
Mm.
sense of the meaning crisis. And
But that's what I think is happening a lot. I mean, there's a repatriation of old ideas and that have been tested and true, like Stoicism is a great example of that, that's come back and that's super popular in like tech spaces and everything, because it works and the ideas work. But I feel like if you take self-improvement seriously enough, eventually you'll get to the idea of God and the logos and all of this stuff, because it's about being the best person that you can be morally, or in terms of, that's the question, like, how do you be a good person? And so the self-improvement and all that kind of secular stuff will end up there if you really take it, if you push it to its extreme. Maybe like we have with psychedelics and in our own life, you kind of come full circle and you got to go, well, clearly they were onto something. It's kind of what I think.
Yeah, and I guess that there's a combination here that I want to bring together. Is a sense of accessing the ancient wisdom
Mm,
in the context of the texts and all of that,
mm,
and the practices.
mm,
But there is also a sense in which we tap into and participate with an originary wisdom that is very much present.
mm,
It's, I
mm,
believe it's in a sense like in our DNA.
mm,
It's deeply embedded in the human being to be able to attune to rhythm and attune to beauty
mm,
in the world, and um, to have this kind of communing with others and to getting into this higher order coherence together
yeah.
and feeling, the ecstasy and the rest and the insight and everything that can flow through that. And
Mm,
so we have to do both. And I think that's what John and his whole project is plugging in all that material and all the footnotes and all the references
yeah.
and plugging it into a Dialogos.
Yeah.
And yeah, ultimately it's about each of us.
And creating the language, I suppose, to fit it into our worldview so we can understand it. But I agree 100% with what you're saying in that the wisdom is, in some sense, already, it's there. I think that's why those ancient wisdom are the ones that do survive, that do live, is because it taps into something universal. It's not something that's just like disembodied and theoretical. It's something very much to do with who we are, our biological evolved nature and our social, cultural, psychological nature, that there is a sort of, you know, a way of doing it, or that it's kind of, that we've observed ourselves for long enough and said, look, this is kind of how we work. These are the things we desire. These are the things that, we avoid, but we should confront. And these are kind of our rhythms that carry our patterns that come out, and then we encode them. And so having the ability to understand that is also about understanding yourself, in that the way of the that you are already are these things, like what we talked about with the intergenerational trauma. I mean, we are each a product of the past, of all these ideas, of all these things that exist. There's no way of separating ourselves from it. I don't think we will. So maybe, it's time to reintegrate it, to understand it, and to live it.
Yeah, that feels, yeah, very deeply at the heart of my life project and what I've sought to do with my ideas is
Mm,
to give image and metaphor and a sense of like that movement. For me, branching patterns and trees have
mm,
gone a lot into my work and my life, and very much of that spirit of reconnecting our ideas with our experience. Um, that sense of getting rooted down
mm.
into the
Yeah.
roots of yourself, where you grew up, but also your collective soil, and understanding that collective cultural ground and getting rooted in it rather than just being sort of unconsciously blind on top of it.
Mm.
Once you root, you're going to unleash a lot of emotional energy and cry for a long time, and
Yeah.
then it comes through, and branches outward.
Mm.
And we, as human beings tripping through time, get to sort of be that channel through which the past and the future meet. And then it
Whoa.
really, it becomes about how well we can,
Mm,
like, how well can we carry the tune and allow that to flow through.
mm,
Because we're not ultimately in control. We've sort of woken up in the midst of this Shakespearean cosmic psychedelic trip through time,
You're starting to sound like McKenna
And
now.
we have to just like realize that and
Yeah, and
deeply
grapple with it.
participate with it and make it the best that we can.
I think that's a pretty good place to finish it off. But this has been incredible, as as expected that it would be interesting. But I think you've fairly blown my mind. Um, what are you going to do next, Jacob? And where can people find you if they want to do Dialogos and watch your podcast and follow your journey?
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure doing this conversation as well.
Well,
Like
definitely we'll have to do it again. I'm sure we will. Since we're
I knew when I found you online that there was a lot of pieces to connect. Um, so yeah, people can find me at jacobkishere.com/discover Dialogos. And yeah, from my website, you'll find all my social media and that stuff.
hmm,
But yeah, this has been awesome.
yeah, thank you for speaking with me, and thank you for your time. And
And yeah, you
let's
said what's next? Sorry, I was going to answer
yeah.
that question. Yeah, I'm doing my practice. I'm doing my podcast.
Hmm,
I'm starting my life engaged with my girlfriend, and we're
yeah.
hoping to find time to make more music. But the project for me is how do I become the instrument that can deliver Dialogos to teams,
Hmm,
organizations, um, and larger contexts. Um, and also I think I'm working on a sort of secret pet project of creating a quite unique Dialogos immersion experience and trying to bring
nice.
together like a Justice League of interesting
Yeah.
people who are like really flowing with it, and then see what happens out of that and let that
Cool.
sort of be a big generative container.
That sounds pretty damn cool. I would definitely be interested in that. That's yeah, wow. So exciting stuff coming, and I would encourage everybody that's listening or watching on video, to check out your work, check out your podcast, and to just experience the Dialogos. I mean, it's it's something that I'm glad now that I've found it that I have, and I think it's definitely the way forward out of this cultural crisis. I suspect, and other things as well. But that's a good basis to start us off. So, Jacob, again, thank you.
Thank you, Mahan.